Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Governance Made Easy webinar titled today, Identifying and Managing Conflict of Interest, with our special guests, Stephen Bowman and the very lovely Julie Garland McClellan. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 45 odd minutes. Firstly, thanks for attending. We really appreciate the effort you make to be here for our live webinar events. During the session, if you have any questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom toolbar. We'll be answering as many of these as we have time for. Feel free to use the chat as well. Finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a very short survey, it'll take you about a minute. At the end of the webinar, you'll go in the draw to win our $400 gift hamper. Now, for those who are not too familiar with Board Pro, we are a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, and we serve about 20,000 users around the globe. We enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more efficiently and effectively with clever software, of course, with less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. Okay, let me introduce, actually, you know what? I'm going to change it up, guys, this time. I'm going to have you introduce yourselves. So starting with you first, Stephen, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome along to this webinar. Steve Bowman, I've been working with boards, either as CEO or chair of boards or directors, probably for about 45 years. And over the last 20 years, I've been advising boards in a whole range of different areas around strategy, risk, governance, leadership, and so on. So I look forward to having this chat led by Julie. Julie, yours.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie Garland McClellan, otherwise known as Julie because the rest is far too much to say. And I've been full-time in governance now for just over 20 years, but I started on my first board back in the 1980s and have been teaching governance for directors through various institutions in the interim between those two. So really happy to meet you. I've had the experience, and this is a neat little segue for Sean, who is doing the slides for us today. I've had the experience of managing boards' conflicts of interests for many years, and it's one of the things that I've found is just absolutely essential. It's one of those things, and Stephen, you'll nod and agree that, yep, it can cause so much trouble, and yet it's so hard when it's not causing trouble to pluck up the courage and address it. So what we're going to be talking about today are some of the nature of how you identify them, how you raise the conversation. We don't have time to get much into the management thereof, but we will talk about documentation. And if you want to go deeper into it, there is actually a masterclass that allows you some practical hands-on playing with it. Next slide, Sean.
Thanks, Julie.
So the reason conflict of interest is such a huge issue is because in New Zealand and Australia, and also in South Africa, and in Singapore, you will find that the duty of a director is owed to the company itself as a separate legal entity. And that can cause trouble even when you're on the board of a state-based organization that's part of a national organization. Actually knowing, do I owe my duty to the members of the association, to this board, or to the board that is actually the parent company board, can be quite taxing for directors. And there are always people who will plead a case that you should be listening to them and not taking that specific company view. Stephen, you've probably seen this many times.
Absolutely. We're dealing with one at the moment where they are a federated organization, and one of the ways they manage that, and they actually do it really well, is that they remind each director who comes from a state-based organization, reminds them at the start of every meeting their duties as a director. And it's interesting because we've just done a review, and what the director said is it's actually a really great reminder, because sometimes we come hot on the heels from a meeting that we had in our state organization, and they've given me the things I want to make sure we get across. And so I come along there determined to get those across. And then I'm reminded that I'm actually here for the board on whom I'm on, so I can share those views, but I cannot prosecute them without listening to others as well. So there's all sorts of really clever ways of managing it. One of the best ways is to actually remind people and to have a very good policy around conflict of interest, to remind them that it's okay to have a conflict. What's not okay is not to declare it and not to manage it. Julie.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the saying "no conflict, no interest" does sometimes hold true. So it's really quite important. These 5 fundamentals actually touch on conflict of interest, and they come from a fairly ancient tome, which is The Fish Rots from the Head, which was published by Bob Garrett. More than 20 years ago, more like 25. But he talks a lot about this primary duty to the company and getting that concept. I heard somebody, you'll chuckle at this, Stephen, at the AICD conference the other day, refer to people who take the shareholder primacy model as shareholder primates. And it really is like the gorilla in the boardroom.
Yeah.
So I was very pleased that that's the first of his fundamentals. But the next one is the board's collegiality and collective responsibility. And one of the things you'll often find is directors who are on what I call nested or embedded boards have a real difficulty understanding that collegiate confidentiality and not leaking board business, especially when it's their boss that asks.
And one of the tools that people have found useful but still aren't used nearly enough is for it to be very clear about what a director can share and what they can't share before you leave that board meeting. And so one of the great things that you can do is that, particularly if you're sitting on another subsidiary board, or you're sitting on other boards that are related to what it is that you're doing, actually get very clear clarity about what you can and can't say. And sometimes even some boards that I know have given out speaking points about the things that you can actually say that they agree. The main thing is you agree. Don't just assume.
Yes. And again, if it's there in the minutes or if it's there in your board protocol, it's for your protection as a director. It is not there to hamper you in the performance of your duties. I had this experience. I was on the board of Vencorp, which was the Victorian Electricity Network. And I was on the board at the time at which we designed and then implemented the first Australian freely traded electricity market. So we had so much that we had to take out for consultation. And so some of our board papers would be clearly marked. This is for consultation with your community. And anything that didn't have that mark on it, zip it. Do not mention. So really important for the board to think through, what do we have? And this is almost like cybersecurity 101. What information do we have? Where is it? Who has access to it? And who are they allowed to discuss it with? Who can they share it with? So really think through that conflict around ownership of information and sharing of information, as well as the standard conflicts of interest. And next slide, please. I'm sitting here clicking away, wondering why it's not working. But it's really important to think through the normal conflict of interest, which is where you are acting to benefit yourself or to benefit somebody else who's usually a related party, is not as common as we would think. It does still arise, but it's much easier to identify. It's the sharing of information, it's that casual use of company property, those other things that we do without properly stopping to examine them. And the second one this is from the Australian Corporations Act. The Companies Law in New Zealand has some very similar provisions, is about not using your position or the information that you get from it to cause harm to the corporation. And a very wise thing before you say anything is to think, could this possibly be a source of harm? Directors should think very carefully. And yet, one of the problems, I think, with conflicts is that we define it a little bit too precisely. I love those broader definitions where you say a conflict is anything that gives a director an interest in this decision. And it doesn't matter if that's a relationship, even if it's only a friendship. It doesn't matter if that's a historical tie. It doesn't matter if it's financial. It doesn't matter what it is. But you will often see contracts and constitutions, and I can see Stephen laughing, but you often see them carefully defined, must be pecuniary, must be direct, must not be. Just think about anything that hampers your ability to freely make the decision in the best interest of the company is a conflict. Would you agree, Stephen?
I think one of the issues always there, Julie, is the law gives guidance but doesn't give detail. So, for example, pecuniary interest, causing harm, none of it's defined because, in inverted commas, it depends. And so the key thing in all of this is that the director has to ask themselves, could this be misused? Could it? Is it providing, potentially causing harm to the organisation on whose board I'm currently sitting? And just have to be very careful about what that means. Do I stand to gain personally at this? Well, it depends on whose point of view you look at. So I think really the key thing in all of this, Julie, and you've touched on it, is that you should be talking, the board should be talking about our directors' interests. And from that, we then have a discussion about whether there's a conflict. And so, for example, a very simple thing that you can do straight away is have a look at your board agenda. And if on your board agenda it says present apologies, declarations of conflict of interest, change that so it says declarations of interest. Then it's up to the board to decide. And yeah, an interests register. Don't call it a conflicts of interest register, because there may or may not be conflicts with some of them. So just be aware of how we view this. And still too many boards and directors see conflict as a negative. It's not a negative. It's just a way that we can manage both our legal responsibilities, but also the strategic conversations that we could or should have. Julie?
Yeah, totally agree. Getting those of you on government sector boards, you'll have a little bit of trouble taking that advice because you get prescriptive rules about having conflict registers. But talking about interests, one of the most interesting ones that I've ever seen, an interesting interest, is one where a registered club, one of the members of the club ran a commercial laundry and did all of the club's laundry at cost, which was a major saving for the club. And it was a win-win for the member because just volume going through your business, it helps to cover the overheads. However, when people elsewhere in the club started to talk about this, they discovered that the board fell apart. Half of the directors weren't even aware that this contract was in place. The chair of the audit committee was really excited about, well, how do we know it's commercial terms if we haven't been out to tender for years? And it really damaged the reputations of everybody concerned. Whereas if they'd been talking about it and alert to it, they would have gone through the process of making sure that it was commercial, making sure that they had the right words to discuss it. Now, I'm going to address very quickly. There's a question in the Q&A. In fact, there are two questions in the Q&A that I will address. I'll address the first one, Rory. I'll address your question later when we get to the slide. And Graham, I'll address yours now. When the board is leaking information, that is actually a breach of confidentiality, and it usually occurs either because of a conflict of interest or a conflict of duty. And the best thing to do is to sit down and have a word with your chair, and we'll talk more later about some useful phrases that you can use. Comment from Kathy in the chat. Is it a conflict of interest for an employee to be on the board? Yes. However, it's also a good idea. If you look at the ABC board, many years ago, they had a court case where I think it was John Maroney was the employee director, and they were approving budgets, and one of the lines was a headcount reduction of so many. And John sat up and he said, which heads? Big difference if we're reducing front of camera talent, and that's going to impact how people feel about watching us, or if we're reducing back of camera talent, and that's going to impact the quality and the production of what we put out, or if we're reducing head office and admin, and that might impact our reporting and our systems. We really need more detail. And the board said, oh, no, we can't give you that because you're a staff member and you'll leak it and it would be terrible. And he said, well, I can't make a decision if I don't know that. So that one went all the way up to the High Court, who said that as a director, you have an absolute right to the information you reasonably need to make your decisions. And they felt that, yes, it was reasonable to know which heads were being reduced. So the information was given, the decisions were made, the budget was approved. There's no public record of what happened after that, but it looks as if Mr. Maroney did his job, did his duty, and just used the information for the purpose of making a good decision. So having an employee director gives you those insights that, yeah, not all heads are equal, but it also gives you those potential conflicts, and you need very good people. So, yep, really important. Just think through all of those issues. And yes, employees on the board, ex-employees, and particularly ex-CEOs. I always like to see if a CEO is going to join the board, they take a 6-month holiday. They might give their mobile phone number to their replacement so that they can call them in the case of an emergency to seek some counsel, but they shouldn't be interacting. They need some distance just to really come to the realization that their hands are no longer on those executive levers. Comments, Stephen?
Yeah, you see this quite often with CEOs going onto a board. In particular, I'm smiling because I'm reflecting on a situation that we had to deal with in the middle of last year, where you've got CEOs of the constituent organisations who are also the directors of the organisation. So we had one not that long ago where each of the states could nominate a director, and they all nominated the CEOs because they thought it was easier. The difficulty was there were a couple of CEOs that couldn't get out of their head that the fact that they were CEOs, and so they came along to the board too, protect the interests and their own agenda as a CEO. And they could not and would not see that there was a conflict. And the board was sophisticated enough to get most of the constituent states and territories to appoint someone who was not on the state body, nor was the CEO. But there were 3 holdout states where they would continue to send their CEO. So the only way they could deal with that is by redacting the board minutes and the board agenda, so that anything that impacted on that state, that CEO did not get access to. And funnily enough, that was about 3/4 of the board papers. So the end result was that the state body realized that this was ludicrous and ridiculous. And it wasn't until they got their head around the legal ramifications and what the national board had to do that they actually saw that it wasn't relevant to actually have a CEO on there. We wanted someone, the best of the best from our state being on the board, rather than one that had a particular agenda or power struggle. So it can get quite nasty, but there are certain things that you can do as well to manage that. Julie?
Oh, yeah, there's always things you can do. And the first thing to do is to disclose. Talk about it, get it in writing. I really like boards to have a policy that puts a positive obligation on directors to raise the issue if they perceive a conflict with themselves or any other director. Which some people find quite confronting, but very often the person with the conflict is the person who's least able to see the implications, and particularly the potential reputation damage if that conflict gets disclosed in an uncontrolled manner. So my view is, start by writing a policy. There's a sample policy template coming up, which you'll be able to scan with your mobile devices. And even if you can't, we'll send it to you, I'm sure. But have a policy. And then when you've got a policy, monitor your compliance against it. I had a terrible situation once where we had a major shareholder on a board. We were raising capital, and after the capital raise, a shareholder who hadn't taken part wrote us a letter and said, well, this director was on the board, knew about it, invested in it, benefited from it. I want shares at that price. The shares had tripled in value by then. So we wrote back and said no, and they complained to the regulators, as disgruntled shareholders will. We were able to write back to the stock exchange and say, look, here's our conflict of interest policy. This is a record of the times when we used that policy to keep this director out of discussions so that he wasn't taking part in decisions. This is the process that we developed for briefing him on the decisions we'd made, because as a director, he's responsible for implementing them. And here are the share trading policies, all of the other policies that might be of interest. And they wrote back and said, thank you very much. We wish you great success in the future.
Julie, that raises a really interesting insight for people who are listening or watching this, and that is one of the best ways to start to get the culture of your board where it needs to be is through the induction program, where you actually not only give people a copy of the conflict of interest policy, but also give them the anecdotes of where it's been used. Exactly what you were saying, Julie. And what we've found, we've got one at the moment where one of the recommendations to their board is that they actually collect the stories of where they used the disclosure of interest and the conflict of interest, how they used it, and the outcomes that came from it. People learn from stories, not from bits of paper. So if you can collect some of those anecdotes from the history of your organization of where you've used it, or start collecting them now and actually embed it into your induction program, because most people particularly in the sector where you get people joining your board that may not have had a long career in being on boards, particularly professional and trade associations or social impact organisations, they really haven't got much experience in it. So to educate them and also provide them examples goes a long way towards creating the culture that is actually required that can add more value.
Yeah,
Julie?
totally agree. And don't think they have to get onto the board before you can start educating them. Actually, a nominations pack that sets out quite clearly, if you decide to put your name forward, these are the standards of behavior that we'll be holding you to. Really important. So quick and easy run through. You must have a policy. Once you've got a policy, train people so they know about it, and then check that they're complying. Make sure that you're complying. Most policies will have a standing or an annual or a statutory declaration or a primary declaration, which is the one you fill in every year. But then from time to time, you'll read something in your minutes and you'll go, oh, I actually know that person. Why do I know that person? Oh, that person we're going to give a grant to happens, in my case, to be my husband's tennis doubles partner. Oops. Quick, pick up the phone, call the company secretary and say, look, I just want to record an ad hoc or an interim or an ordinary declaration. I've got halfway through reading this paper. I've realized that the person who's going to be receiving the grant is a family friend. I'm going to stop reading now. I'll abstain from the decision and leave the room. And as soon as I hang up from you, I'm going to call the chair and just run that past them as well. Because you can't possibly foresee everything that's going to come up for the next year. So having those two different types and making it be okay, but keep records, make sure that people are aware of what's going on. Now, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I'm aware that we've really only got 15 minutes left. So talking through, Rory, that was your live answer. It's very, very useful to have a full disclosure of interests for board members, but that's not enough. You also need to add the interim extra ones that pop up from time to time.
Can I just add to that too, Julie?
Yeah.
It's expected these days that if you have come across a potential conflict, then you let the chair know immediately. Don't wait for the board meeting.
Oh, no.
So you don't wait just to declare it at the board meeting. You, as Julie said, and that great story that she shared with us, once you've recognised that you may potentially have a conflict, then talk to the chair or talk to the company secretary and register it, and then leave it up to the board to decide how best to deal with it. But you, in the meantime, can actually recuse yourself from either reading some of the material or say, look, I've said I haven't read this material, I'll send it back to you, whatever it might be. But do what you think is appropriate, because having a conflict is not a wrongness. It just is. We just need to be aware of it. Julie.
Yeah. And in my story, it was even worse because they would send us an email before the board papers came out to say, these are the grants that we're considering. Is everyone okay? And I'd written back and said, yeah, I don't know any of those companies. I didn't, but I knew the CEO of one. So again, these things will come up. Now, a question from someone, having the CEO also as an elected volunteer non-exec director is a conflict, but is it common or is it generally frowned on or is it unlawful? It's common. It's generally liked because they have that knowledge, that detailed information, and it's perfectly legal, completely lawful. Sean, you wanted to have a comment on that as well? No.
No comment from me, Julie.
Okay. Employees.
Can we just cover, Julie? There's a longer question from Claire, which I think is actually really interesting. Can it be considered a conflict of interest for board members to demand Percival demand, input on recruitment and appointment of junior operational staff when they have family members who directly benefit from the services provided by those employees. These are real life situations.
Yeah. Oh,
Julie?
that one is huge. And yes, it is. It's definitely a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest if it's your family member that you would like to see appointed. And it's a conflict of interest if you or your family are the customers that would interface with the person. But at the same time, it's really useful. I mean, I like it when I go to my local supermarket and I see one of the directors of that great big listed supermarket entity queuing up at the checkout. It's wonderful that they know the staff in that store and what it's like. I get absolutely ropeable when I see people who are on the boards of retail companies and they don't shop at their own shops. For heaven's sake, they're open to the public. Just go in. But understanding the difference between providing an insight and a piece of information and actually impacting a management decision about the employment, promotion, or rewarding of a member of staff are two different things. So to say to the CEO casually, I was in this store, and by the way, this staff member, my goodness, so happy, dealt with the customer in front of me that was grumpy. What a lovely person you've got there. Tell the store manager, well done. Very different to saying, oh, I was in this store and this person, I think you should remove that person, or I think you should promote that person. That's crossing the line. And you'll notice that it's about acting from your conflict, not about having it. So yeah, when you've got family members, that can be an issue. When you're involved in appointing, family businesses are rife with conflicts. And there's a lovely question from Nahamo. I hope I'm pronouncing your beautiful name correctly, but there's a proposal in South Africa that staff should be represented on boards. South Africa's a very special case. I have huge respect for Professor King and the reforms and the governance that he's brought in. But South Africa is very much, their governance has a second aim, which is the healing of a society that has been wounded. And so you have to look at their governance in their context. And yes, there's a huge wealth imbalance. There's a color gradation as you get from the owners of capital to the providers of labor. So there are reasons that South Africa is looking at that. And again, you just have to handle those comments. Yes, definitions of conflict, I like to have a broad definition. If you've got an enabling legislation or a Financial Management Act that talks about direct pecuniary, just remember that in law, a perceived conflict is still a conflict. It doesn't even have to be real. As long as it impacts on other people's opinions and your reputation, you have to deal with it. So
to keep in mind, conflict should always have 3 words before it. Real, perceived, or potential. Pretty much covers everything.
And a lovely question here from Joanne. Is it appropriate for a director with a parent using the company's aged care services to discuss and make decisions about the services if it's to help improve the services? Again, it's appropriate, but it's a conflict of interest. So you need to approach these situations with a level of transparency. Say, look, obviously I'm conflicted. However, I think doing this and this would improve the services for everybody. Maybe a good idea to abstain from the decision, but to put your insights into the conversation. The board should decide as a whole how they want to handle the conflict, and then you handle it the way you've decided. And I've never seen a court, I don't know if you have, Steve, but I've never seen a court second guess a company and say, your decision was wrong.
Yeah.
If you decide that's a conflict, this is what we're going to do. As I've seen many times where people go, that's a conflict, but we all know about it and we all trust this person and their integrity, so we're going to let them just be here in the discussion because it's quicker and easier. That's entirely your right to decide.
And that's actually been supported by legislation in Australia quite a few years ago now. The business judgment rule has an impact on that as well too. That, you know, in essence, if we did all the right sorts of things and we just got it wrong, oh well, that's business.
Yep, definitely. So I think that's all the questions in the Q&A. Let's have a look at the questions in the chat. CEO and company secretary, that is a massive role, but it's very typical to see either the CEO, the CFO, or somebody else be the company secretary. Yes, it's possible.
Julie, if I can just add to that too, these days, if you're going to appoint someone as a company secretary, make sure you support them by giving them the training they need to be actually a good company secretary. So yes, you can appoint all sorts of different people, but for heaven's sake, get them some training or get them some experience so that they can actually do their job properly. It's no longer an honorary position. It is something that is, you know, it's an incredibly influential and can be very, very useful position for people. So help them with that.
Yes, very, very important. The same with directors. If you're appointing someone to be a director, train them in how to be a director. If you're appointing someone as a company secretary, train them. I read a statistic in the Financial Review yesterday that had my hair standing on end, which was that 80% of managers had never received any training or support on management. Gosh, help. But the same would be true of company directors. So the more you train, the more you think about, the more you learn how to have those difficult conversations, the better. There's no conflict if you employ someone and then don't employ them and then employ them again. In fact, speaking as someone who's had maternity leave, these things happen. Because back in the day when I had mine, the automatic right to return wasn't there. Conflicts of interest do not change for things like a First Nations board, but they do have to be managed very carefully because it was Milton Friedman who said the only legitimate purpose of business is the pursuit of profit within the rules of the legal frameworks, regulations, and rightful expectations of the societies in which they operate. And so for you, Anne-Marie, that difficulty is the rightful expectation of a First Nations society is different to the rightful expectations of Woolworths. It's different to the rightful expectations of the Correctional Services Industry Board. It's different to the rightful expectations of all sorts of other boards. When a director refuses to acknowledge a conflict or leave the room, oh, you are in trouble, Brendan. Lawyer up is about the only thing I can say. And that's the sort of situation that helps lawyers buy mercs. So really be careful. I have seen boards do all sorts of things, delegate the entire operation of the company to an operating committee and have one board meeting a year, and then be very firm that the conflicted director did not take part in the committee meetings or receive or see the papers, which I don't like. I like all directors to have access to committee papers. I've seen one recently where a director admitted to having sexually harassed and possibly even abused 3 different staff members, refused to give an undertaking that they wouldn't do it again, kept insisting on being involved as a director in the investigation process, and refused to stand down from the board or do anything about it. And that particular company had no choice but to go to an EGM, which was horrific, because even though you have a duty as a director to raise these issues and consider them, you have a duty as a citizen not to defame anyone else.
Mm.
And so writing the notice of meeting and the wording of the resolution took a lot of very careful legal work. But your obligation is to manage it. Yep, I would worry about nested boards. We'll be doing a deep dive session on this topic next week. So that will be another piece. We're really running through, oh my goodness, lots of really great questions
They're
here.
well thought out questions, I must say. They're very good.
Yeah, it's obvious that we're serving a need, or maybe we're just ripping off the Band-Aid and having a look at the wound. I'm really sorry. But two things we've got for you, two really powerful things: a policy template and a conflict of interest checklist. So please scan those. You can do it right now, or you can do it later when you get your copy of these, which will be sent round to you. We've got like literally 60 seconds. Gosh, I think we need a whole day masterclass next time, Sean.
Seemed like it, doesn't it?
It does.
Me.
It does.
I'm looking at the Q&A board in the chat board, and I'm not quite sure where to start and where to finish.
I think I think one of the key messages coming across is that conflict of interest is never a problem until it is, and then it's a real big problem. And so one of the issues there is to really educate your directors about what it looks like, to really get them to understand, do a deep dive around your conflict of interest policy. Now, there's no point in having a policy unless you make it live. So actually, as part of the induction, and then maybe once a year as a refresher, actually go through what that looks like and remind them at every board meeting. And when there is bad behavior, the worst thing to do with bad behavior is to not deal with it straight away. So you start to look at what are the options that we've got, and particularly for those directors that are flaunting it or refuse to acknowledge, then they're different conversations that you've got to have. And know at some stage you may need to lawyer up in some of these areas, but even the lawyers don't necessarily know how to deal with some of these things sometimes. So the key thing is to take it out of the murky things of let's hope it never happens, and really understand how we can manage it, what we've managed in the past, and any bad behavior that does come up, deal with it straight away. Julie.
Yeah, I agree. The more you practice with this stuff, the better. Just looking at some of these questions following on, if you've got a full disclosure that's a really long laundry list, you're doing well. Now what you've got to do is train people to quickly go through and keep abreast of that. And this is something that your company secretary should be all over. They should be covering that like a rain sheet on a tent on a wet day. You really want them to be your first line of defense. When I said that conflicts of interest for a First Nations board do not change, what I meant was you have exactly the same legal duty to manage conflicts of interest and not to act when you have them as any other company. But you still have different rightful expectations from your community. And it can be fraught. It can be very fraught. Yeah, the Corporations Act does refer to material personal interest, and the courts have said that it should be likely to affect the decision making, but the courts have also acted where the material personal interest was a relationship, not money, or where there was an interest in the way in which the business would be conducted. By the way, there is a workbook that goes with the masterclass that gives written, referenced, proper examples for you. And I really encourage you to come back and do the masterclass and we can get into this. Because I could sit here all day. We are indeed only just scratching the surface.
We could call this the questions responded to session.
Yep. Well, I think that's next week sometime.
Yeah.
Now, just before we go, everybody, I'd just like to remind you all, for those that are in Auckland or traveling through Auckland on or around May 9th, we have a really special in-person event, which we're calling Governance Unplugged with Linda Carroll and Stephen Bowman. It's going to be an opportunity to network with your peers, CEOs, directors, chairs of organizations, first and foremost, but also to have your many governance questions, sticky or whatever, answered by Stephen and Linda through the session. So look forward to hosting you there. If you'd like to attend, just scan the QR code on screen there and you'll go through to the invitation page.